for some reason which I don't understand, all my novels are first-person narratives, and all the short stories I've written are third person. I have no idea why that is, but that's the way it has happened. And anybody who's written a first-person narrative novel knows that or discovers, if they didn't know it ahead of time, that you're going to be identified with the narrator of the novel. Your friends are going to, of course, hear your voice when they read the book, and it's going to be especially difficult for them. Strangers, it doesn't much matter. But there is that identification. When I came to writing this book, even before I came to writing this book, my wife died after I had written the book that just precedes this. She had read everything in that last book and in the first Renato book. And before it was published, we were about to go down and see the publisher, as a matter of fact, when she passed away. And I had a great sense of revulsion against that Renato the painter, because I knew instinctively that people would identify me with him, and I hated the idea. I took the galleys of the book and threw them in the garage, which is usually the stop that precedes being thrown away entirely. And it took about a year. As a matter of fact, I think it was exactly a year before the publisher and I got together and went ahead with that publication, because I was thoroughly aware that there'd be that identification. And that's true about this book too, of course. I could have written a memoir, I suppose. I do know that when I sat down during 2 or 3 years, I didn't feel like writing at all. And my friends all said, "Oh, you're a writer, you'll write." That was the last thing in my mind. I did, after a few years, come to the point where I wanted not to write so much, but I wanted to have the feeling I used to have when I did have a piece of work I was writing. I really liked that feeling, and I wanted it back again. And sooner or later, I did write a short story and another short story. But whenever I sat down to write, my head was simply filled with death. And it became apparent finally that I wouldn't write anything unless I wrote something about death, something about grief. So the question was, what? And as much as I didn't like the idea of writing a first-person narrative, I certainly didn't want to write a memoir. And one of the things that had happened to me during that early period, very early, was the recognition that what had happened to me, which astonished me, was happening to people every day, all over the globe. I wasn't unique at all. But grief is a strange emotion. Everybody here has felt anger and hatred and remorse. Everybody here has felt attraction or repulsion from other people. But grief is something you've never felt unless somebody you love has died. It's a remarkably unique emotion. And later, years later, some years later, reading about it, reading about other people's experiences, one of the things that carried through from all of these people who had experienced grief was how astonished they were at this emotion that they had never felt before. It's not the same as depression. It's not the same as sadness. It's its own thing. And that's what's remarkable about this unique emotion, is that when I was looking around at other people's experiences and actually going online to find out if anybody had felt this way before, it turns out a lot of people have felt this way before. I found I could really identify with this woman in England who was the wife of a lorry driver. Everything she said was exactly the way I felt. And it's one of the curious things is how similar people's experiences can be while being unique in all the details. So it took me a while to get back to writing. And in that interval, I talked to people, mostly women as a matter of fact. Mostly men die first in any marriage. I remember when I was taking my mother around, or rather my wife and I were experimenting by looking at different places as my mother aged, and as she got towards 100 years old, we felt we should really look for an assisted living facility. And we would go there at noontime, and there'd be a sea of white-haired women with a sprinkling, just a sprinkling of men. So a lot of the people I spoke to were, as a matter of fact, women. And the curious thing about the people who talked to me about, well, maybe it isn't curious, about their grief was how they didn't lie. They told me the truth, which was very hard to hear. But no one ever faked. They all told me the truth. And when it came time to write, I wanted to write something that was true, but nobody in his right mind wants to write a depressing book. It's bad for the writer and it's bad for the reader. And the trick is to write, or rather I found it interesting and difficult to write this book. I wanted to tell the truth, and I had absolutely no desire to write a depressing book. Is that an answer?
Yes, and I think you succeeded. For me, in reading the book, it was not a depressing book. It was a book that in many ways, it's like seeing a tragedy. When you finish with a tragedy, there's a feeling of something that's happened. There's a purging of emotion. There's a lifting. And there's an uplifting feeling in this book to me, even though, as you've sometimes said, you're not sure of what the structure was at all of it, or even if it was structured. And could you say a bit about how the book is structured? Because one thing I've noticed is that our main character, Renato, who is so full of life in Renato the Painter, a book I strongly recommend to everyone, finds himself as if all of his senses have been cut off.
Yeah, it's funny, or ironic. When I wrote Renato the Painter, I decided I wanted to write a really life-affirming book. At the end of that book, everybody who's possibly could get pregnant is pregnant. You know, that's I wanted that. Renato's paintings aren't so successful. As a matter of fact, his project completely collapsed. That's his life. And Renato is a deeply flawed person, but a very creative person, and the people around him. It's I think, a life-affirming story. And I had no intention, I had an intention of writing one more book, sort of round off a group of books that are, these characters are all connected in an extended way. But I didn't intend to write this book. No one would ever intend to write a book like Renato After Alba. But when I did start to write it, it was kind of weird. I went back to Renato the Painter, and there are all sorts of things that
Presaged it.
yes, that I found in the book that made sense in this book.
I like the way that the two uncles in Renato the Painter, who are very philosophical, who are always arguing about the meaning of life, that whole idea of philosophy becomes so important.
Well, the advantage also of writing this book instead of a memoir is that Renato's life is very roomy, and so I could bring into it experiences that I hadn't felt, but that other people I knew who had experienced this particular kind of grief had felt. The other thing I wanted to bring in was a philosophical dimension. I think that people think, actually. I think people wonder about death. I think they wonder, what happens when you die? Is there such a place as heaven? Things like that. But the people I know, at least, whenever we would give brunches with all my secular friends together, about a third of the conversation would be spent discussing religious points and theology and so forth. The only people who don't discuss ideas are people in novels. But the real people I know, they're always discussing ideas. They're arguing about politics. Politics doesn't get discussed in novels either. Otherwise, you'd be missing half of your readers. That's true. But at least we have some philosophical ideas, and I tried to weave them into the story. As a matter of fact, yes, in Renato the Painter, the narrator has got two uncles who, when he goes off to art school, they want to make sure he gets educated. One of them is an aeronautical engineer who's always giving him books on calculus and things like that. And the other one is a man who's interested in literature, who's giving him long lists of classic novels that he ought to read, things of that sort. So when I came to write this book, those two uncles were available to me to develop those ideas, the philosophical ideas. So this book, I'm not trying to scare you away, but it mentions Lucretius, it mentions quantum mechanics, it mentions Sartre, not Sartre, but it mentions the existential philosophies that were very common at the time. People do crave, they do discuss philosophical ideas.